everyone. Thank you very much for Katya to invite me here. So when I asked Katya why I'm in this track, so she said I would follow up really nicely about this discussion about technologies in terms of families. So I'm a computer scientist, and I'm hoping, my talk is going to give a different kind of flavor with all this array of really excellent presentations so far from today. What I really want to share with you guys is a quick discussion about the role of family technologies in all of this. As a computer scientist, we just want to create more technologies to create the problems solved by technologies. So why do we do that? Is there a legit reason for that? So I think many of you guys know that children are spending a lot of time online these days, but how much? This is the latest report from Ofcom 2023's report, which is an annual report produced in the UK, creating a summary of the media usage, including a particular one for children's media usage. The latest report shows that 97% of the children in the UK are active online, which is not a big jump in comparison to the data from 2 years ago, which was 95%. But if you look at the general population's average time, it's 93%. So that means children in the UK these days, there is a bigger percentage of them online than the general adults. But at the same time, the report shows that there's a sharp jump in terms of the ownership of devices for above 10 years old in the UK. So 2 years ago, the report shows it was 50%, but now we have a 10% jump. What do they do? So most of the children, they go online through mobile devices. And what is especially interesting from this year's report is to show that children under 13 years old, over 50% of them owning their own mobile devices and 80% having their own tablet. As a result, they spend a lot of the time on all these mobile platforms dominated by social media platforms many of us are quite familiar with. And many of us in the room would know that the children under 13 years old are not expected to be on these platforms. And so this is the big backdrop of my research. It's understandable that we are spending a lot of efforts these days trying to figure out how we can do better as researchers and how we can keep our children safer online. But what I really want to put on a discussion here is really, we think in the HCI community, as well as in many related research community, the role of supporting children's digital autonomy has been hugely underexplored. When we're talking about, children have trouble to walk away from their screen, when we're saying children have trouble to make sense of the information being personalized for their interests on the internet, when children have trouble to really decide whether the friends were recommended to them on the platform were really truly their friends, or just the platforms told them that it would be good for them to be their friends, they have been subjected to behavior engineering, information manipulation constantly. Therefore, we are really arguing that in addition to all these approaches for keeping children online, it's really a time for us to think about how we can introduce paradigm shift, new design thinking in terms of supporting children to flourish in the digital era, this respect and digital autonomy. So that's the kind of key hypothesis that we are trying to drive forward in our research group. And what do we mean by digital autonomy? So we had a big literature research led by our Dr. Johnston, a new postdoctoral researcher in our research group, looking at the literature from education science and psychology. So the meaning of control, the sense of entitlement came up quite strongly in all this literature. But what is also quite interesting is to see that in many of this literature, they have highlighted that children don't have the competence to develop and exercise their agency and autonomy. And as computer scientists, we would like to contest that. Is it really true? Is it a loose course that we're going down? So we came across this literature by Spear, etc., from 2004, where they did a systematic review of all this definition for digital autonomy from all related to caring and education communities for children. And Spear, they proposed this definition for digital autonomy in the context of adolescence, means the state of being independent, self-governing, and free and able to exercise one's wishes without external control or influence. Okay. And what is also quite interesting with Spear's definition is that they propose these three-dimension perspectives for looking at the children's digital autonomy from the cognitive, behavior, and emotional aspects. And that's a quite interesting framework because in HCI, we have done lots of work to support the cognitive and behavior autonomy through lots of design interventions, which I'm going to show you in the next slides. But this has been a very useful framework to help us to identify the gaps in our existing HCI research in terms of supporting children's emotional autonomy, which I will come back towards the end of the talk. So as I said in the previous slides, we're curious to see what's the landscape that looks like in terms of HCI designs to support children's autonomy. So we have a long tradition of trying to create digital interventions, drawing on behavioral psychology and children's developmental psychology literature to design interventions that will promote a good behavior, good habit. And more recently, like Nata mentioned in her presentation, there is a wave of looking at how to structurally support children's digital literacy development to enhance their cognitive autonomy development as a result of making more informed decisions. But what we notice that what is missing in all this work is that the children are unique. They are unique because we think they're more vulnerable. They are going through a transitional phase. They are not developing their autonomy just in the vacuum by themselves. They do not go from a toddler into an 18-year-old where I have all these self-regulation abilities suddenly. They grow in a family, and family has a very big role in the whole process for children's development. But there has been very little work in HCI looking into the role of families in supporting children's autonomy. We see a lot of work in terms of how families control, monitor civilians' children to keep them safe, but not so much in terms of what kind of support there are to help the parents help their children navigate all these risks in a constructive way. So this is what motivated us, trying to look at, what is the role of family technologies in the landscape at the moment. When we started all this journey, it was quite fascinating to see that despite our all good meaning, parental control apps are still the dominant mechanisms out there. It's so dominating to the extent that the latest Ofcom report from 2023 reported 7 in 10 families in the UK are using a certain type of control mechanism. So it actually gives me a cringe because I have young children and we don't use any control mechanisms. Not saying that I'm a better parent, but I think what it really shocks me is the prevalence of parental control mechanisms at home these days. Parents are really, really craving for support. But if you look at all these different leading parental control apps out there in the market from the HCI and design point of view, you would realize that they're different. They provide various levels of control. They could have very detailed controls or trying to help parents block away certain type of distracting apps. Or they could also try to facilitate the parents to use award systems to encourage good digital habits. So what does all these nuances for design mean? Are any of them more effective for parents keeping their children safe or not? And so that motivated us. First research hypothesis is trying to find out all these different kinds of design patterns, what there are in the market, and to what extent the children and families think about all these design patterns. And we used a two-dimensional research methodology. First of all, we tried to manually walk through the key app features in the top Android parental control apps. We identified all the critical user interaction moments, like the registration, like all the control mechanisms that would ask parents to do, or any feedback when things got blocked, got broken. And because the research took place during the pandemic, our lovely plan of complementing this app feature analysis with empirical data from users went down the drain. So what we did instead, we tried to analyze the app review data from the Google Play Store, and we did a really careful sifting of all these app review data in order to make sure that we have an even distribution for market-leading apps from the large companies versus those apps have a good market status, but from smaller companies. So we can ensure that the data is fairly distributed to give us a good representative of information. So I'm not going to go into details for all the nitty-gritties of our findings, but I just want to highlight in terms of for HCI's point of view and what would be useful for you for this workshop today. We identified 3 key categories of app features. The first one you can't read from here, which is called granularity of controls. So we have found apps impose really strict granularity of controls. You can either use it till 8 p.m. or nothing after 8 p.m. That's bedtime. Or we have on the right side very detailed granularity of control. So parents can go into every app and control lots of nitty-gritties, what they can do, what they can't do in each of the app. And there is something in the middle where it's the kind of example I showed earlier. You could design a group of apps, game apps, no, education apps, yes. So it was really interesting to find the users' reviews feedback is that actually parents are really struggling with all these very detailed control mechanisms. They found they're often lost in all these choices. It's really time consuming for them to get things right, and the effort is really not paying off. Whereas the middle ground has turned out to be most liked by most parents and the children. And the second category of design features we found is the amount of feedback and the transparency the app would provide for the families and for the users. Once the activities was blocked by the parental control apps, whether any feedback was provided, the majority of the apps basically, yes, you're blocked. End of the story. And only a handful of the apps that we analyzed would try to give some more informative feedback to, explain to the children why this happened and suggest some actions for children to follow up. So, most of the families really, really liked those kind of features. But what is really interesting is that those features are only available in a handful of apps. And 2 years on, when we went back to the market, these apps have disappeared. They no longer exist on the app market. And that is a very interesting question. And the third category of app features we identified is the level of communication support that would be provided by different parental control apps. So quite similarly, the majority of the apps on the market, they don't provide any communication support, whereas a handful of them, they would purposefully nudge the children to say, go get your parents, discuss these kind of issues, and this is another set of independent apps that they just disappeared on the market. Whereas the market today is continuing to be dominated by those features that promote control, promote surveillance, and often led by large companies, right? So I think that is a very interesting question to follow up. Is it because survival? Is it because independent companies struggle to put up niche features that are hardly recognized and understood by the users community? But for us, it's been a very valuable experience. Not only we found out in the process that, parents and the children, they like the control mechanism somehow. Some of the children were saying that it's really what I need. I really need to get hold of my digital habits. But the majority of them, they're really struggling with the excessive control, and they are really demanding for what we call this zone of best practice, represented by a few independent developers, which have sadly disappeared today. But for research purposes, what we want to do, follow up this initial landscape study, is to take all this zone of best practice forward, and we design our digital intervention and see how that works. To what extent all these design patterns we thought were positively perceived by users would actually be having positive effects on our families. And so to do this, we took on board the two design considerations. The first one is this playful by design considerations promoted by Five Rights and the Digital Future Commissions last year. Our first prototype of our toolkit turns out that it's really, really important to make the app really engaging for the children and families, but otherwise parents would take too much of the leadership in imposing the process. And the second set of design consideration we took on board is Kai-Fi's critical algorithmic literacy theory, which gives us a structured way for us to put forward all these digital risks in front of families. Although we are not developing an educational tool, but we found Kai-Fi's framework has been giving us a very nice way to talk about and evaluate what kind of digital thinking would be critical for children to establish digital autonomy and the sense of control. So I took off the screenshots of our toolkit because the paper is still under review, and because we decided to put this as welcoming remote participants. But if anyone's interested, please do come to me, and I will be very happy to show you some screenshots. We carried out a mixed method evaluation of the toolkit this summer. We invited all the families to come in. Normally it's adults. There's 1 or 3 children coming to the lab in Oxford. And we asked the families to install our toolkit onto a children's device. And we spent an hour to observe how the families use the toolkit jointly together to carry out a set of designed tasks. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details of our key findings, but I'm just to highlight a few key points which may be interesting for today's discussions. First of all, we noticed how this hybrid toolkit, which is not just an app, but also compose a lot of physical data cards children and parents could play with during the interaction with the toolkit. It has a very effective consequence of enhancing children's sense of empowerment, because now they see all these data risks in front of themselves, but also they could control, the interactions with their families, with their parents, by positioning the data cards on the desks. And parents at the same time, they felt like they're more equipped. They have this kind of framework supported by our task sheets and information sheets to talk about all these data risks and the process. They learn so much more about all this data their children may be sharing. All these so-called good education apps actually are collecting a lot of information about their children. So they're absolutely astonished by this kind of process. It's not all positive. There are some improvements that we have to do with the toolkit, obviously. But for us, in terms of like a design understanding, we found it's really important to identify some critical design patterns for us to further explore, which have turned out to be very important to trigger lots of knowledge sharing, lots of bonding moments, to share equal family dynamics in the process of interacting with the toolkits. What I want to conclude the talk with is to draw all this experience, this journey of us trying to understand the landscape and trying to mitigate with the situation, this informed set of design guidelines, and see what happens. What is really interesting for us when we are trying to reflect this journey through children's digital rights point of view, first of all, obviously, a lot of the digital technologies out there, particularly the social media platforms we have seen, are really disrespecting many of the children's fundamental digital rights, like their rights to be children, their rights to develop. But at the same time, we have noticed that a lot of the parental control apps, which are supposed to be out there, keeping our children safe, protect them, are actually violating many fundamental children's digital rights. With excessive monitoring and surveillance approaches, they prevent children have the opportunity to develop themselves as children. And what we do find quite encouraging with our little toolkit as very much like a first step, trying to see, can we do something to make a difference to this monitor-driven kind of landscape? We found there are a lot of alignment with rights by design kind of principles that we would really like to continue to advocate, both to our HCI community as well as to many related communities like parental mediation, like digital media engagement, but also with policymakers, because what we found is really struggling for the parents is to have a set of informed guidance to see what is the right thing for us to do at the moment. And I also think digital rights, like what Karen said, is a nice international framework for us to construct the conversation across a certain different variety of cultures. So I think that's why, that's our focus as a next step to see how we can extend the toolkit, align using digital rights as the kind of benchmark. And that's many. So I have to talk very, very fast today. Sorry about that. I hope I'm on time.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. This is really fascinating. So we have some time for questions. Do we have questions? I had a quick question maybe before further questions. I found it fascinating that what you found that what was particularly desirable for the parents in 2021 disappeared by 2023. So we're often told about the market logic, right?
Yes.
So that, the stuff, and often I think in the literature we hear about that it's, people consciously decide like they prefer certain things because they're convenient. And yes, maybe it's not the best practice, but that's the actual preference. And your research seems to point that this is not true. So could you comment on that?
So that's not my kind of a real research area, so I couldn't comment extensively on that. But I do feel like there are a few interesting raw data in there if anyone here would like to follow that up with me. I think one hand is that many of those companies with interesting features, they are independent small companies or they are startups, unlike the big companies, they are quite robust. So those small companies, they need time to get recognized. And often they try so hard to provide all these good features that are better aligned with children's interests. Well, they don't have the other features, like the control, the monitor features that parents still feel like it's quite fundamental for them to get some control of their children's behaviors online. There is probably like a starting point, entry point, that these independent apps, they feel like we want to do things right. So we don't want to have all these things that parents, they think this is not right. I think that's one thing in terms of like feature completeness. There is like balance there. And the other one, I think it was quite a difficult time. All of these startups happened before the pandemic just started. Our review happened. And I remember our review happened just before the pandemic. I remember some of the apps that were so positively reviewed by some really major mainstream media, and they are having a lot of money, funding injected into it. But it's a very difficult economic situation to survive. What you're building is probably not the most needed, like a tracker app for health. So I think that's the kind of two quick observations that I had. When we were trying to build our own toolkit, over 3 years time now, we started to talk with some innovation centers to see how we could roll this out as a public service. I think we have received a mix of feedback. We have to be quite careful when you're just trying to do something good. maybe it's not enough just to survive the market, which is complex, depressing. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. My question is, when you're doing feature analysis, did you include anything around the analysis of business model or the privacy features of these tracker apps to see how those may have related to the other features that you came across in the review?
No, we didn't, because one way of doing the app feature analysis was really trying to see, what kind of digital autonomy support mechanism they were having in those apps, instead of, what kind of infringement to children's data privacy that they were trying to do themselves. Is that what you are
Yeah, I was
after?
wondering if you saw like
Yeah,
a relationship,
yeah.
if some app is more privacy invasive, if that might have led to different
Yeah,
selection of features on the app.
yeah. I did have a student, he did analysis of that front as well. But I think the conclusion, unfortunately, that they are not much better behaved than all the other. So this is one of the phenomena. I don't know whether audience here aware of, so there is a pervasive behavior. Whenever you use a mobile app, there will be often associated with a minimum of 10 third-party trackers. So this is one of the research findings from our research group as well. And one of my PhD students, he also analyzed the parental control apps to see whether they would behave differently. And the sad news is that no, they don't behave much more differently. And so they still have a lot of trackers behind it. So in addition to most of these apps are for free, in addition to support the families, the irony is that they're still collecting children's data in order to make themselves survive.
Yeah, this is what I was about to ask in a more explicit way. So is it that they survived the market because they collect more data? And because my impression is, but I have no evidence about it, is that in order to protect children, we eventually end up providing more data about children.
Yeah, no, I think that's the irony of this, right? So what would be the right business model in order to, if we think technology support is the way to go forward, what would be the right business model to make this happen? No, I mean, based on my naivety, I look at government.
Do you also see, when it comes to the responsibility of these providers?
Yeah.
You're talking about digital rights, and I think there's a shift when we think about human rights and the obligation of states and governments to protect and respect rights. But now we see more of a movement to extend that to private companies as well, so like rugby principles and so on.
Yeah.
At the moment, that's just a set of guideline principles and so on. But do you see that maybe there's a case here that this obligation under the human rights framework gets extended?
I really would like to see that happen. I wasn't able to say that because I have 20 minutes clock. What I really found is in the children's space, there's a lot of legislation development recently, but they are not always followed through because compliance is quite difficult. But there's very important dimension of considering the rights for children. I think it's a very powerful one. It's not even considered in any of the regulation development. Obviously, the ICO's age appropriate design is grounded on children's best interests, but that's just a kind of, in my opinion, just a corner. And also, when we're talking about the impact of AI system on children, I think we really have to extend the conversation beyond just the children's best interest. We really have to think about what does best interest mean and how to measure this kind of a harm, demonstrate this kind of harm and impact. And I think this digital design, digital rights framework is a very powerful one because you can really tell the story quite quickly, so this is immediately having negative impact on children's developmental opportunities, etc., etc. So I would really like to see that coming. It's picking up more in HCR community, talking about rights by design. So I'm really hoping legislation, let's work on that together.
We possibly did, and everyone keeps going.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're
This was
welcome.
fascinating.
Thank you.